And without further ado, I would love to welcome our speaker, Andrzej Stewart from NASA. And I will just go ahead and turn it right over to you, sir.
Certainly, thank you very much. And I actually appreciate y'all having me talk with y'all today. A lot of what I'm going to discuss in this presentation actually happened right there on the Big Island. So it's my first chance getting to kind of talk with a group from Hawaii since moving here to Houston. And so this is kind of a little bit almost a homecoming for me here for this. So I appreciate y'all having me today. But before I kind of really get into my presentation, I'm going to start by taking us on a little bit of a journey. And this is going to be a journey in a virtual sense. Nobody's ever actually been to Mars yet, but we're going to do a virtual journey out to the planet Mars. And so let's see, can you all see the presentation here? Excellent. Okay, so like any journey, we've got to start somewhere. And for this presentation, we're going to start at the International Space Station. And that's a heck of a place to start, but let's say you're an astronaut aboard the ISS. You wake up in the morning and this is the view out your bedroom window. And from what I understand, it is an amazing view. You can look at that cupola and see the entire planet Earth kind of spreading out below you. And now we think of space as being very far away, but it turns out, depending on where you are in your orbit, you're probably not all that far from home after all. I like showing this photo here. This was a photograph that was taken by an astronaut aboard the International Space Station. Nothing fancy. They just had a camera with a zoom lens, and so they floated over to one of the windows, zoomed in, and snapped a photo. And the reason I like this photograph in particular is because right here in the middle of the photograph is the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. And so that's where the astronauts do most of their training. You see all the housing areas around that center. Most of the astronauts have houses in the area. So the astronaut that took this photograph, their house is probably somewhere in this photo. So even though they're in space, they could very much still see their house from there. But as I said, we're going on a journey. This is just the start. So we'll keep on heading out into space now. This photograph, a very famous photograph called the Blue Marble, and it was taken during the Apollo 17 mission, which is the most recent mission to take humans out to the moon. And we're farther out now. Instead of being in low Earth orbit, we're far enough that instead of just seeing a horizon out there, we can see the entire globe of the Earth. So we're getting farther, but we still see some familiar sights. We see in this photograph the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. We see the familiar coastline of Africa. If you look closely towards the bottom of the photograph, you can see Antarctica. So you can still see aspects of our planet that are familiar. We still got a long way to go, though, so let's keep on going. Another famous photograph, one I particularly like here, it's called Earthrise. And so this was a photograph taken during Apollo 8. And Apollo 8, people think of Apollo 11 as being the first time humans went to the moon. That was the first time we landed. But Apollo 8 was the first time humans circled the moon. So we circled a couple of times before we finally landed on 11. The moon is kind of the farthest we've ever been from Earth. And so this photograph represents kind of the farthest distance humans have ever been from planet Earth. Even at this distance, you still see that globe, you still see cloud formations, you still see oceans, you still see continents. There's a lot of empty space between here and Mars, so now we're just going to jump all the way out there now. And so we, as humans, have never been to Mars before, but we've sent a fleet of sort of robotic explorers ahead of us. And so that's been orbiters, landers, and rovers. And this particular photograph was taken by a rover called Curiosity. And Curiosity had been on the surface of Mars for about a year whenever the flight controllers at JPL in California told it to point its camera back at Earth and take a photo. And if you're looking for it, it's that tiny dot right there. Man, that is a long way away from home. So, if you're an astronaut, you're in a confined space, you're with a group of people. A mission to Mars to get there and come back is about a 2.5-year process. So there's a lot of stresses here. And add to that, whenever we send people to Mars for the first time, we've never sent people that far away from home before. So they might be stressed out by things like homesickness. We don't know yet. And so it'd be nice if we could kind of practice first, if we could kind of learn about all these stresses in kind of a safer environment here on Earth before we send people out to Mars to do it for real. Well, it turns out we do have some practice. Mars is here on Earth that we can use to study those things. The one on the right there, the one that looks like it's inside sort of a shiny warehouse, that's the Human Exploration Research Analog, and that's right here in Houston. And that's a facility that NASA uses to study these stresses. So they put test subjects in there, and they make it seem like they're in space. So they simulate space missions. Whenever I went in, so I've done a mission in there, I went in for 14 days. And that was a simulated mission out to an asteroid. And during those 14 days, I was isolated. NASA kind of studied me, studied my teammates, studied our stress levels. And they're actually up to 45-day missions now. We actually had a mission start today with a new crew in there. But I enjoyed my experience in there, even though it was challenging. I enjoyed it so much that I decided to do it again. And that's the photograph on the left, right there on the northern slope of Mauna Loa. That is the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation. It's high seas for short. And if anybody's driven on the saddle road west out of Hilo, if you look to the south, there's a tiny white dot up on that mountain. That's that facility right there. There, they, at the time, were doing much longer simulations. So instead of 2 weeks, I spent a whole year in there, 366 days, again, simulating the stresses involved with space flight to a place like Mars. For this one, because we had sort of the geographically young lava flows there, we simulated a Mars mission rather than sort of an orbital mission. And these are what NASA refers to as analogs. They're things that are kind of designed to simulate some part of the spaceflight experience. And NASA goes to great lengths to make them kind of as realistic as possible. So up there on the northern slope of Mauna Loa, there's a lot, again, of those young lava flows out there, not a whole lot of large animal life or plant life. And so even though you're here on Earth, it very much looks like Mars. And there's a lot of things that NASA can do to make it feel even more like being on another planet. Now, whenever I talk about facilities like this, these space analogs, they're part of kind of a larger group of facilities that we call isolated and confined environments. Let me see if my notes come up. There they are. And this includes things like submarines, bases down in Antarctica, even the International Space Station. These are all isolated, confined environments. And they've got some things that tend to cause stress in the people that live there. They tend to be remote. So places that are far away. If you think about the International Space Station, it's up there in orbit. And even though it's close to Earth, it's still not exactly a place where a lot of people live. They tend to be difficult to get to sometimes. Again, the International Space Station, if you want to get there, you can't just drive there in a car. You've got to get into a rocket and get flown there by NASA or the Russian Space Agency, or nowadays SpaceX. These are difficult places to get to. If you want to get to Antarctica, you have to get a series of cargo flights through Christchurch, New Zealand. And the reason they're so sort of isolated and difficult to get to is because they're often located in dangerous places. The vacuum of space is fairly hostile to life. As is Antarctica. If you're in a submarine at sea, the underwater environment, these are all places that are trying to harm you if you're not careful. Because of those dangers, you don't get to go outside very often. And if you do, you often have to wear some sort of protective gear to protect you from those harmful elements. And so for astronauts aboard the space station, that's heavy spacesuits. And that's if you get to go out at all. If you're in a submarine out at sea, you may be stuck inside a really small confined environment for a long time. And then the last factor here, it's a little different from the rest, but whenever we select people to go to places like this, they're not necessarily people that know each other ahead of time. So for an Antarctic research station, we may be looking for maybe the best scientists in the world to go down, or for a space mission, we might be looking for the world's best spacecraft pilot, for example. But they're not necessarily people who are related or who knew each other before the mission. And so all of these add to stress, the stress level, kind of above and beyond just a normal environment. So you're isolated, you're in a small environment, you might not get to leave very often, you're with people that you might not get along with very well. And so NASA is kind of simulating all of these in their space analogs to try and get a feel for what will happen whenever astronauts have to do them for real. I've made it sound kind of very isolated and very lonely in these places, but you do go with a crew of people. And these are the crews of the 2 missions I was a part of. So the 2-week mission, the shorter mission, that's the crew in the left in the blue shirts there. I'm on the far left. I was the flight engineer for the mission. To my left is Linda Royburn, and she is originally here from Houston. She's in the Air National Guard, originally here in Texas, but she's moved over to Florida since. And she's what NASA calls a mission specialist. So essentially NASA's term for a scientist astronaut. Shana Gifford was there as one of our mission specialists as well, and she's a doctor currently living in St. Louis. And finally, in front of us there, seated, is Ethan Good, and he's a flight controller here at NASA, has previous experience at the South Pole, and he was our commander for the mission. So moving from a crew of 4 for the shorter mission to a crew of 6 for the year-long mission. And for this mission, we actually had an international crew. So Cyprien Verseau there on the far left, he's from France, Paris, and he's a biologist. So he was studying bacteria and how astronauts may be able to use those and keep them alive in the space environment for ways to help them, nourishment, that sort of thing. Christiane Heinecke to his left, she's a physicist from Germany, and she was our chief science officer. So making sure we did all the science objectives that NASA had assigned to us throughout the mission. Carmel Johnson to her left is our crew commander, and she hails from Montana, as does Tristan Bassingthwaite, who's to her left. He was studying at the University of Hawaii at the time, and he was studying architecture. So not just how to design a habitat to keep astronauts alive in space, but also one that would be comfortable, something that they would want to live in. Shana Gifford was on this mission as well as our crew doctor and health and safety officer. And then finally, I'm there on the right as the engineering officer. So it's kind of my job to keep the habitat up and running, making sure we had enough supplies and things like that, so that the scientists team could focus on their science without worrying about the habitat around them breaking or anything like that. What I like to stress here is, because we were isolated for the duration of this mission, these were the only people I talked to. So for those 5 people with me in those red shirts there, those were the only 5 people I saw and talked with directly for an entire year. I like to talk about the habitat a little bit, especially high seas, because again, there's some unique factors that kind of make it sort of this unique and sometimes stressful place to live. Part of that is whenever you're on a space mission or even a simulated one, things take on a little bit of a different sort of value, I guess. So whenever you're here on Earth, money has value. You can spend it places, you can go, and if you run out of food, you can go buy more food, or if things break, you can go buy more things. In space, there's no stores. So money isn't the thing that has value in space. The things that do have value are the things that keep you alive. So for an astronaut, that's power, water, air, and time. And a shortage of one of those can very significantly impact your day. For high seas, we had plenty of air because we were here on Earth, but the other 3 were very limited resources that we kind of had to balance. Being up on the slope of the mountain meant that we were disconnected from the rest of the island. And so all the power there is generated by solar panel. For the most part, we did have a backup hydrogen fuel cell system if it was an extremely cloudy day, but for the most part, what that meant was we were relying on the sun for most of our electrical power. And so if it was a cloudy day, maybe we didn't get as much power. Maybe that means we wouldn't have enough to use the oven that night to make a warm meal. If it was in the winter when it was colder, maybe that meant we wouldn't be able to run the heater as much. And so on days like that, maybe we would wear extra layers of clothing or stay under our blankets for maybe a few extra minutes in the morning to warm up. So a shortage of electricity, you definitely feel that. That would definitely kind of impact your stress level, the things you could do in a day. We also had a limited amount of water. So water in space, on the space station, we found ways to recycle that water. All wastewater on the station gets recycled. It's very expensive technology though. So for our mission, we kind of simulated that by having a limited supply instead. So we were able to get down to about 4 gallons of water per person per day. And that's 4 gallons for everything. Hygiene, cleaning the habitat, cooking food, 4 gallons. And the way we did that, we took some extreme measures. Whenever we'd wash our hands, we had a bowl in the sink that would catch that water. That would become mop water later in the week. We took Navy showers. So whenever we showered, we'd spray ourselves for a second, turn the water off, put the soap on, and then we'd have 1 minute of water to spray all that soap off. So we went to some very extreme measures to save water where we could. So you've got all these resources and you have to keep track of them. And so just like a real spacecraft, in high seas, we had a screen that showed us the levels of all these resources. So that's what you're seeing at the top there is the screen we had. And it showed things like power levels, how much power we had in our batteries, how quickly the solar panels were charging, how much water we had left. And we had a flight control team that could watch these numbers as well. And we even had air quality monitors in the habitat. So our mission control team could look at some of these numbers and actually determine the sort of things we were doing by looking at how quickly these numbers went up or down. One example they like to tell us about is they could look at our carbon dioxide monitor and they could tell when we were working out by looking at that, because whenever we're working out, we'd be breathing more and they would see that carbon dioxide spike. But speaking of that mission control team, turns out whenever you're out at Mars, it's really difficult to work with a mission control team or even just talk to anybody back on planet Earth because of something that's fundamental to the size of the solar system. And I'll show that with a couple of pictures here. So Earth and Mars, they're both orbiting around the sun. And they kind of orbit at different rates. And so sometimes they're very close together, sometimes they're far apart. Whenever they're as close together as they get, which is what this picture shows, they're 55 million kilometers in separation. And that's a hard number to kind of grasp. So to put it in maybe simpler terms, that's 3 light minutes. It's the distance that light, at the speed of light, travels in 3 minutes. That's whenever they're close together. Whenever they're far apart, that time expands to 22 minutes, 401 million kilometers. And the reason that's important is because whenever we talk between Earth and a spacecraft or a space station or something like that, we use radio waves. And radio waves are basically just another flavor of light. And so that means a radio wave would take 22 minutes to cross that gap as well. So let's say you're on Mars and you're at this time of the year and you wake up in the morning, you call Mission Control in Houston. You say, hey, Houston, this is Mars Base 1. We're just starting out for the day. How are you guys doing back there in Texas? And you wait for 22 minutes for that signal to cross space. Your signal finally gets to Houston, and the mission controllers here at Johnson Space Center pick up the phone and they say, hey, it's good to hear from you guys. You know, the weather's starting to cool down here a little bit. We're finally getting into fall. How's the weather up there on Mars today? And you wait another 22 minutes. So 44 minutes have gone by, and so far all you guys have done is say hi to each other. Conversations that would take minutes here on Earth all of a sudden take hours or even days on Mars because of this time delay. And so this was a major part of our mission, was adding this time delay to our communications. For Hera, we started in real time and they slowly added delay as the mission went on to make it feel like we were getting farther and farther. For high seas, we started at 20 minutes and spent the whole mission at 20 minutes. For me, this was the hardest part of the mission, just because there's kind of no way around it. It makes it difficult to work with a control team. You know, you send a message, you hope they get it. If they don't, you can't just pick up the phone and say, hey, did you get my email? You know, you kind of just have to wait, and you have to wait 40 minutes to see if they got it. And, you know, if they misunderstood something you wrote in that email, there might be more and more back and forth that goes on, and that takes a lot of time to do. That being said, it's not all bad. Whenever we're there, having that gap in sort of communications, it makes it sort of a quieter environment. You don't have the internet, you don't have YouTube, you don't have a lot of things that you realize kind of bombard you with information throughout the day. So it makes it this kind of very quiet, I kind of call it a monastic experience. It's like living in a monastery almost, and gives you the ability to kind of focus. There are very few distractions. So, you know, I'm like anybody else. I like to, you know, stop and watch a video on YouTube, but you'd go and do that in the habitat and you couldn't do it. There was no internet. So you'd feel like, well, can't distract myself. I guess I better get back to work then. talked about the habitat itself and some of the stresses, but let's talk about what life is like in there a little bit. And honestly, it's not all that different from life sort of on Earth. An astronaut will wake up in the morning, have breakfast, spend their day working, stop for lunch somewhere in the middle, and at the end of the day, eat dinner and have some time to themselves. And our days look very similar to that. Works on Earth, turns out it works in space as well. The difference being is kind of what the work part of the day entails. And so for an astronaut, they're doing work during the day, but that work is specifically science. For a Mars astronaut, it's going to be the science of the planet that they happen to be standing on at that point. For us, we were doing science as well, but instead of the science being on the thing that we were standing on, we were the science instead. And so that meant studying our moods, studying our sort of interactions with each other. And they did this in a number of ways. One of the ways they did it was through surveys. I literally filled in thousands of surveys over the course of the 2 missions. I had 3 surveys I had to fill in before my head could hit the pillow at night before bed. And, it can get frustrating after a while, but you focus and you fill in. They're asking questions such as, how did you work with your crew members today? What's your level of stress today? Did anything significant go on that we should know about? But that's kind of one way of doing it. The other way of doing it, and this was kind of the way I liked, was they do things called flight-like tasks. So you're doing the same sort of things that astronauts would be doing on Mars, with the added dimension that you're not just doing them for the reasons they would, but you're doing it so you can be measured and kind of evaluated as well. And that's not to give you a grade. It's not like they're going to give you an A or an F, but they want to see how well you're doing. Are you getting better at that task as you do it over and over again? Or are the stresses starting to slow you down a little bit? And the reason they're doing that is because they hope that the astronauts, whenever they're put in similar situations, will act in similar ways. And so if they can come up with ways to detect those problems and counteract those stresses now, those will be techniques they can use when the astronauts are doing them as well. You might have seen some of our photographs that for high seas, we did get to leave the habitat every once in a while in sort of makeshift spacesuits. And again, this will be the same thing that we want out of astronauts on Mars. We don't want them to just live inside that habitat and do nothing. We want them to go outside, dig in the dirt, take samples of the planet, measure the planet itself, do geology and things like that. And so for us, we had similar tasks to what astronauts would have to do. Every couple of weeks, our mission control team would send us a geology task that we would have to accomplish. And so we'd have to put the suits on and go do those measurements. We also had other crew members that had experiments that were running outside as well. So some of my fellow crewmates had some things that they wanted to try out. And then finally, sometimes things break and you have to go outside and fix them. And so we'd have to put the suits on and go make those repairs. One thing, again, I'll point out is even though you were still outside, you're in a spacesuit, just like the astronauts would have to be to protect them from the Martian environment. So you were still encapsulated in something. So you never truly felt like you were outside and breathing the fresh air. So speaking of repairing things, I've mentioned it before, but again, there's no stores in space. And turns out there's no janitors either. So whenever you see astronauts on TV, they're doing fun things. They're riding in rockets, they're doing spacewalks outside the space station, and all that looks like great fun. And yeah, there's a fun part to the job, but the stuff you don't see on TV is that they still have to do everything else that you and I have to do here on Earth as well, except it's a little harder because they're in zero G and things are floating around. So whenever I give this presentation to school children, what I'll say is, if your parents are telling you to clean your room and making you do that, they're not doing it to be mean. They're doing it to teach you how to be an astronaut, because astronauts have to clean their own rooms as well. And they have to fix things. Again, you can't go to the store to buy a replacement if something breaks. You either have to have a spare or you have to repair it with what you've got. And so the photo in the top left there, that was a stove that had broken. And we had another one that had broken earlier in the mission. So that's me taking pieces of each of the 2 stoves and putting them together so we had a working hot plate that we could cook with again. So talking about that hot plate and the cooking, I'd like to spend a couple of slides talking about the food, because whenever you're on a mission like this, Um, a lot of things after a while kind of become normal, which sounds a little weird. But what I mean is, you start out, you're going on this mission and you're going to be experiencing all these strange new things. And the first couple of weeks you're there, they are kind of new and exciting, but you kind of get used to them after a while. And after a while, these things just kind of become a routine. So I found myself at one point in the mission waking up on like a Wednesday morning and going, well, I guess I better put my spacesuit on because it's Wednesday and Wednesday's spacesuit day, which I realize now is an absolutely absurd thing to do. I mean, who wakes up thinking, oh, I better put my spacesuit on? But there, it was just a normal part of life. But the food was the thing that was just different enough that it reminded me I was still doing something a little unique. For the 2-week mission at the Johnson Space Center, because we're here at the center, we actually got to eat the same food that the astronauts eat on the station. And a lot of the food is basically designed to last a long time. It takes a lot of time to cook the food here in Houston, then ship it to Florida, put it on a rocket, fly it up to the space station, and then store it up there for a few months until the astronauts finally get around to eating it. And so it's a lot of things like you see in the top right there. It's freeze-dried, vacuum-packed. Whenever you get them, they don't really seem like they should be edible. What you're seeing there is a shrimp cocktail, and it looks and feels kind of like styrofoam. And the way you cook it is you add the water back to it. So if it's a hot meal, you add warm water. And as you add that water, it kind of turns back into food before your very eyes, almost like a magic trick. And it doesn't sound very appetizing, but what I found is a lot of the food was actually really good. It was better than I expected. The one thing you kind of miss, though, is the kind of crunch of a fresh carrot. Because you're adding the water in, vegetables turn out mushy. But aside from that, the food was actually very good. I actually kind of ate more variety there than I usually do in day-to-day life. So going from Hera to high seas being on Mauna Loa, isn't it a NASA center? And it's kind of far away from the Space Food Systems Lab in Houston. So there we simulated space food. We used a lot of camping foods, a lot of sort of storm shelter foods, a lot of ingredients. So here we had a full kitchen and we could cook with those ingredients. And again, there was a lot of freeze-dried things, a lot of shelf-stable ingredients. And with enough creativity, you could come up with some interesting foods. So bottom right's our Thanksgiving dinner, and that's a real pumpkin pie. Can of pumpkin lasts a long time, spices last a long time, and flour lasts a long time. Mix them up and bake them, and there's a real pumpkin pie. That turkey, though, is a little different. So what that was a can of freeze-dried turkey chunks. We added the water, added some flour, mixed it up and shaped it, and then we baked it for a little bit. Not as good as your homemade Thanksgiving turkey, admittedly. Tasted kind of like a turkey flavored chicken nugget, to be honest, but you're willing to put up with some creative culinary creations to be able to be on a mission like this. And it really wasn't that bad. The other thing we got to do though there, because we were there for a year, is we got to actually not cook, but grow a little bit of food. Not a lot. Growing food actually takes up a lot of space, way more than we had. So it was sort of a snack that we would have every once in a while rather than a full replacement. So the photo on the bottom left there, that was our first harvest, cherry tomatoes. And out of that plant, we each got one. So we had 6 cherry tomatoes, one each. And for us, that was a formal meal. I'm talking shirts and ties, formal place settings. We all sat there trying to get as many bites out of that tomato as we could because it was the first sort of fresh produce we'd had in several months at that point. So it was kind of a real treat. From then on, we found it was kind of mostly leafy greens and things like that, chards, kales, and that'd be a nice sort of snack we'd have every once in a while. And then the last photo here, actually two slides left, but this photo here, I've talked a lot about hardships and challenges and stresses and things like that, but it turns out astronauts, they can put up with a lot, but they're people too. They're people who get to do cool stuff, but they're still just people. And just like everybody else, astronauts need downtime as well. And so we got downtime too. In Hera, because we weren't there very long and it was such a small habitat, most of our entertainment was books and movies. And so over 2 weeks, we watched several action movies, read a few books, and then by then the mission was over. But for high seas, we had a lot more time because we were there for much longer and we could take our own things. I found that my crewmates, they were the kind of folks who like to learn stuff. So we had a few crew members learning languages. I took a Lego Mindstorms kit to kind of work on my robotic skills. Cyprian down there, he's got that ukulele, and he actually bought that from a uke store in Hilo. Actually, the morning we started the mission, and the first few days, he had never played a uke before. I'll admit the first few days in that dome listening were kind of painful to listen to, but he dedicated himself to it. And by the end of the year in there, he was actually a very good uke player. We also did some group stuff. So in the top left, me and Tristan kind of staged that photo because we wanted to have some fun with the spacesuits, but we did have board game nights kind of once a week in there. If you look behind Tristan there, you see a projector screen. And so Friday nights was movie nights. We had a server full of movies that we'd watch on Friday nights. We even had a crew member who knew how to salsa dance. And so we took salsa dancing lessons while we were in there too. And here's the last slide now. So the last slide, just kind of some extra photographs, mostly of milestones. So whenever you're in an environment like that, it doesn't change very much from day to day. And so it can be really easy to lose track of time. And so we kind of put extra effort into celebrating holidays. For example, if you celebrate something like Christmas, that makes it feel like winter. So that was something we kind of put a lot of focus into, just kind of help us keep our bearings. The other thing we did, though, is we would take photographs on certain milestones. And so at the end of each month we were in there, and also on like day 100, day 200. And so the photograph in the top left was taken on day 300. We kind of picked up what we had around the habitat and dressed like Spartans and tried to do kind of a parody of the movie. The other thing I haven't really been able to portray in the photographs is just how small some of these habitats can be. And so, for example, in Hera, our bunks, I like to kind of refer to my bunk as a compartment because we had enough room to kind of lay back and sit up in there. And that's about it. And so that photograph at the bottom left was a photo we took at the last day of the mission. And that's all four of us jammed into one of those sleeping compartments just to see if we could do it. Anyway, I could talk about this for hours. I mean, altogether, 380 days of my life, I'm really just kind of scratching the surface here, but I don't want to take up all the time. I'd be happy to kind of let y'all ask about what y'all would like to know about too. So if we have time, I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. So I'll kind of
Absolutely.
try and moderate a little bit of the questions. So if somebody has one, if you can hit your reaction button for the raise hand, that'll pop you up to the top of the screen and I'll call you on that. But until we get our first question, I'll just ask, with so much time spent in isolation, that's got to be similar to kind of what so many of us have gone through in the last year. What tips and tricks did you guys develop or did you discover along the way that might be helpful to anybody going through isolation now?
So first off, you point out something very, very important there is I wrote this presentation well before the pandemic. And I used to give this to groups of people who had never kind of experienced that isolation. It's different giving it now because kind of now everybody's experienced it. So everybody's kind of a Mars astronaut at this point.
Not to the same degree, but
but what I'll say, I mean, as far as tips and tricks, again, you're kind of in this environment that never changes. So it helps to kind of put in sort of your own mental breaks, if that makes sense. So, and that's something I do here. I've been doing a lot of teleworking at home. So I've got one part of my home now set up as kind of my home office, and I'll actually get dressed up for work. So I'll wear work clothes while I'm in there. And then I'll, at the end of the day, I'll go to another part of my house, get changed into something else. And that makes it feel that even though I'm in the same environment, I'm doing something that gives me sort of a mental break between the parts of my day. And that's something that's helped me kind of keep my bearings. And that was something I kind of developed in there. I had sort of different clothes that I'd wear during the week and on the weekends. And that helped the weekend feel a little bit more like different from the rest of the week. So it's finding ways to kind of mentally separate things, even though you're in a very small area. I think that's something that's helped me a lot.
Awesome. Great tip. Thank you so much. Anne-Marie, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for that great presentation. You can see I'm in uniform too.
Perfect.
I actually have my work day, and I think what you just said there about having like your work clothes, and I came downstairs, so now I'm at the rest of the world. My office is upstairs. I go to school upstairs. But I wanted to ask, because I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm a middle school teacher. Would you consider presenting to our kids? I teach the distance learning school for Hana Lahaina Luna, Lanai, and Molokai, 3 islands here in Hawaii. And I do the distance learning program. And I'd love to have you as a guest speaker for my kids,
I'd be
if that's
happy to.
possible.
Yeah, the one we'll get in touch afterwards.
Thank
I'd say
you.
talk to Keith for my information. Keith, I saw
I
you
will.
emailed me about, because he'd said some other groups were interested as well. I've got 2 things coming up that's going to make it difficult for me to present for a little while. So what's not in his presentation is I've actually recently gotten selected for a 3rd analog. And so that's going to be 11 days here at the Johnson Space Center in November, and we're going to be studying the atmosphere levels for the Gateway Station. So that's going to be kind of, month of November is difficult. And then the other thing is I'm a flight controller for Artemis, the next Orion mission. So when that's in the air, and that's, I think, supposed to go early next year, that's going to be several weeks where I won't be able to present as well. So I'm kind of juggling those 2 timeframes, but I'm happy to work with you to find a time that works. I'm definitely happy to present with other groups as well.
And I'll get in touch with you, Anne-Marie, with some of the protocols that we have to follow for requesting speakers through NASA and everything like that. But absolutely, yes. Oh, Kat, yes, go ahead.
I'd love to hear a little bit. So you said that you have 0 contact with any civilians during that year-long mission. And so did you have any crewmates that were married, or how does that impact families, or was everyone single? I mean, just curious.
So we did, and that's actually a difference between the 2 missions. So for Hera, we had very limited contact. So we could contact mission control whenever we wanted, but we had sort of designated times that we could speak with family. And that was only during the real-time parts of the mission. And so they actually patched it through sort of what they call the air-to-ground loop. And so it was the same loop that we were talking with mission control on. So for that one, outside of those times, we couldn't communicate. Now, high seas, the year-long was a little different. Now we could communicate anytime we wanted to. So we had email, but again, all of that email was subject to that delay, and there was no voice communication. So we could record messages, we could record videos, or we could send email, but we couldn't like pick up a phone and talk with them directly. And what I'll say is it's challenging. I was married at the time. I'm unfortunately divorced now, but we had another crewmate that was married as well. And we had single crewmates. And what I'll say is it's kind of a mix. There's pluses and minuses to both. On the one hand, the single crew members, they don't necessarily have the stress of trying to keep in touch with a close family member outside the mission. But what I'll say about the married crew members is they have more experience living in close proximity with another person. And so I'd say both sort of types of crew members bring both strengths and weaknesses to the mission. So there's positive and negatives to both.
So thanks. Yes, Arjun.
Thank you very much, Andrea. You mentioned you can talk all day, and we can ask you a question all day too. So, yeah, what about you mentioned about the emotional side, and what about the physical extremes you have to go, like temperature, pressure, and other things? And my second part of the question is, astronaut, are you like originally before astronaut, you're usually engineer, you're there to run the equipment, all of the science thing, I think you can control from Houston, right? Mostly.
So I'll start with the first one, and remind me what the first part of the question was again.
Oh, you mentioned about the emotional changes. How about the physical extremes, like extreme, you practice like on your simulator, like extreme temperature, not taking shower for months or things like that? Like.
Gotcha. So as far as simulating like the physical environment of space, we were only kind of able to do that to a limited extent because we're here on Earth. You know, you're still in Earth atmosphere, Earth gravity, and that sort of thing. So you can't really get as much out of that analog. There are other analogs that do focus on that. So there's a facility in Germany where they do bed rest studies. And for those, they'll put people at a slight tilt back for, I think, up to 60 days at a time. And that has kind of the same effect on the bones and muscles that being up in space does. And so that they have ones, you kind of have to, for your simulation, figure out what it is you want to study and focus on that, because there's some compromise you'll have to make. That being said, there were still parts of that that did affect our mission. So even though we weren't under the stresses of zero G, we still had to work out on a daily basis because astronauts have to do that too. That's one of the countermeasures they use to fight the muscle and bone loss that comes from being in orbit. And so they made us do that as well. What I can say is I came out of there in some of the best physical condition of my life. I mean, it's nice, you know, having a doctor looking over your shoulder, making sure you're doing your workouts, but also being able to do a workout as part of your job. So I had a goal to lose a certain amount of weight. I lost that and even a little bit more. I came out stronger. I came out faster because I had a job where I was working out every day. The other thing, though, that I experienced in there, and it was actually an impact from the diet that we were on, is our diet didn't have a whole lot of salt in it. And I actually got low blood pressure while I was in there. And that was because the food didn't have much added salt and we weren't adding much. And our crew doctor noticed this. I was talking to her about something and I stood up and I got lightheaded. And she's like, hold on a second, do that again. I sat down, I stood up, I got lightheaded. And she's like, let's take your blood pressure. Let's try a couple of different things. And she determined that I hadn't been eating enough salt. So I was getting low pressure whenever I was standing up. And so as part of the rest of the mission, I had a little bowl of salt I had to eat from and add to my food to kind of bring that blood pressure back up. So there were a couple of physical aspects of the mission too. The analog I mentioned coming up in November, again, that one's going to be testing atmosphere levels. And so whenever you're on the space station, those space suits that they wear, they're essentially big balloons and they have joints in them so you can bend your arms and legs. But if you were to wear those suits at full pressure, you wouldn't be able to bend. It would take too much to overcome the stiffness of the suit. And so whenever they go outside, they run at lower pressure. And so what our analog in November is doing is we're testing the pressure that we're going to be using on the gateway station to make sure that we can operate in those. We're going to be testing some sort of pre-breathe activities to avoid the bends and that sort of thing. And to do that, the facility in Houston is actually a completely sealed atmosphere chamber. And so that's kind of the main focus of that mission.
And we had a question come in through the chat. Do women have more difficulty getting into the program and staying in the program if they become pregnant and have children? Oh no, I think I'm frozen.
Any tense moments where people just wanted to get out of the place, and how did you deal with it?
Where people just wanted to get out of the place. It depended on the crew member. What I'll say is we had, for high seas, some ability to schedule our own EVAs. Extravehicular activities where you put on a spacesuit. So they gave us some leeway to be able to kind of schedule those. We'd have to coordinate with our mission control teams in advance. But if we could add some sort of science bent to it, then they'd be able to plan something and get out there and do it. And we were cleared to go outside for up to 6 hours at a time. And so that's kind of how those crew members got out. For me, I found I was actually kind of I'm not sure what this says about me, but I was very comfortable inside those environments. I never really felt a need to get out and be outside. I was okay in there. So I think it depends very much on the individual. I know towards the end of the mission, we had a couple of crew members who were ready to breathe some fresh air again, though. So I know they were happy to get outside and get hiking again, that sort of thing. And I think, Arjun, you had asked me a second half of the question earlier. I don't think I got to that. Could you repeat that again?
Oh, the second half is, what's actually the job of an astronaut? Is it more about maintaining equipments, or I believe that all the science equipments they can control from Houston too, right?
There's a couple of different jobs for what we're doing for the astronauts. So in part, even the astronauts on the space station are experiments as well. So they're doing a lot of life sciences. They're studying those astronauts again for whenever we're getting ready to send astronauts out to Mars. We've got some sort of baseline based on what they've been doing. We try and run a lot of the equipment from the ground, but there's stuff that you just requires sort of human intervention. So a lot of what the astronauts are doing are things that can't be controlled from the ground. Some of those are housekeeping tasks, repair of the station, and a lot of science as well. So we try to automate as much as we can, but we're just not quite there yet. And so that's kind of what those astronauts are doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. And sorry my internet cut out there for a little bit, but I'm glad you all were able to stay on. I'd love to wrap up this conversation with a big mahalo for you joining us from Houston today and for giving us such a great presentation and staying on for all of these excellent questions. And also, I'd like for everybody to join us in the 4-way test of the things we think, say, and do as Rotarians. So first, is it the truth?
The truth.
Is
Second,
it the truth?
Is it fair to all
Is
concerned?
it fair to all concerned?
Third, will it build goodwill?
Will it
and
build
better friendships?
goodwill and better friendships?
Fourth, will it be beneficial to
Be
all concerned?
beneficial to all concerned.
And fifth, have
Have
fun.
fun.
Thank you all so much. And I hope you have a wonderful
you.
rest of your day.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mahalo, aloha.
Mahalo, aloha. Y'all have a great day, y'all.
Thank you,
Okay,
you
we'll
too.
see you back on the Big Island.
Looking forward to it.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Absolutely.